talking to book people about books and other stuff.
Hello and welcome to Talking to Book People about books and other stuff. Today I'm going to talk with Kate Mosse. I'm going to give her a ring in a moment and find out what she has been up to during lockdown, whether she is able to write, whether she is able to focus on reading. She is a best-selling novelist, of course, author of Labyrinth and the remainder of that trilogy. And now, a couple of years ago, she released The Burning Chambers, going back to her Carcassonne setting that she's so renowned for. And volume 2 of this series, The City of Tears, should have been coming out in May, but plans may be shifting for that, I'm afraid. Like all of us, things have had to be altered a little bit. So we'll give her a call, find out what's been going on, maybe get a few little teasers of the new novel, and see what she's got to say. Let's give her a ring. So thanks for taking time to have a chat with us. Are you doing this from Carcassonne, or are you doing this from England, or are you, where are you at?
No, I'm at home in Chichester in West Sussex, which is where we're based nowadays. I've been a carer for over 10 years now, and my parents lived with us. I mean, they're both gone now, sadly, but I still have the marvellous Granny Rosie, who's 90. So we nip backwards and forwards to Carcassonne, but we can't go for very long periods of time, obviously. But the map on the wall behind me is the map of Languedoc and the Cathar Crusade. So I'm surrounded by Carcassonne, even though I'm sitting in Chai.
How are you finding this weird sort of lockdown situation? Are you writing?
Well, I think the thing is that we all are very aware of how difficult it is for other people than it is for us, as it were. So, you know, we live in the outskirts of a town. There are fields nearby. It's pretty rural and quiet anyway. And we have a garden. And so it means that we're not confined in a space. In fact, you know, if we were in our little house in Carcassonne, we would be very, very confined because there's a little terrace out the back, but it's right on a street and we're right in the middle of the town. So, so I think also, I'm sure you're fighting this, for those of us who are writers, it's not that different. No. You know, we sit on our own in our pajamas working a lot of the time, you know, it's how it goes. I mean, the joy of lockdown has been the quiet, the lack of traffic. And I think for many of us who have older children who are proper grown-ups, having our grown-up children home has been an unexpected joy. Not that any of us were expecting to have your 30-year-old and your 27-year-old home for, you know, proper amount of time. That hasn't happened since they were teenagers, you know, when still both at school. And so, you know, when I'm feeling a bit gloomy about the fact that actually my diary is pretty much empty for the entire year now, everything's been bumped, I just think, but really, you know, just, you know, and it's a great time to catch up with reading. But the only thing I would say, Nick, is the first few weeks I couldn't read at all, really, and I couldn't write at all. It's taken me a while for my brain to come back.
Do you think that was just because your brain was so kind of preoccupied by how everything was changing so rapidly, or was it something else?
Well, I think the only time I've really had it before was when my mum died. And for me, reading has always been the one thing that I could rely on. And when my dad died, he'd been very ill for a long time, had been caring for a long time. And it's not that it made it any better, but it was not unexpected. My ma, who was just wonderful, was quite literally on stage with her entertainment troupe. She was in her mid-80s. My mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, who's now 90, played the piano for it. And they were a wonderful group called the Old Timers. And my ma was on stage 2 days before she died, you know, doing high kicks. And so she was like, just gone like that. And after that, and after all the trauma of her going so quickly and all of those things, I lost the ability to read for a month. I just couldn't, nothing held me. That was the thing. And then little by little I tiptoed back by reading all my old favorites. And so it was that, you know, grief stopped me reading, and it took me 6 months before I could write again, actually, after my ma died. And of course, this is not that in any way whatsoever, but I think however lucky we might feel in terms of space or being able to work from home, or all of these things. It is an extraordinary shared trauma that the whole world is going through. A lot of the normal things, my everyday life didn't physically look any different because I'm sitting where I sit to write. You can see it. It's the same as it was, before the lockdown. But it all felt like very unfamiliar. And the way I've got back into reading did exactly the same as I did when I was bereaved. I went back to all my old favorites. So I have reread all of Agatha Christie. I'm now working through Ngaio Marsh, Georgette Heyer, Josephine Tay, Dorothy Elsett. I'm just one by one.
Those classic British crime era,
Golden Age, the ladies of the Golden Age, and they are. And I've read all of those novels so many times. And that's eased me back into reading.
Hey, have you ever seen that, or do you have that edition of Miss Marple that they did in a single volume? Have you heard of that?
Not only do I have it, Nick, but I wrote the introduction to it.
Did you? I didn't know that.
I did.
I have it somewhere, but I didn't.
And it comes in this beautiful wooden case.
Yeah,
and it's all together. And the aim was that it was to be the biggest book, and it is still the biggest book in the Guinness Book of Records.
Yeah, it's the biggest spine, isn't it? It's
biggest spine.
So
I've been doing a couple of Zoom things and a lot of things like this chatting. And I've got a really old desktop. This is my laptop, but they're both quite ropey and old. So I've had to do a couple in my husband's, in front of my husband's computer. And he has a homemade stand-up desk, i.e. not one that can go up and down, it just is. And he's a hell of a lot taller than me. So I'm afraid to say that my most recent engagement with the biggest book in the world, Miss Marple, was standing on it.
Well, it shows that it's robustly made. I mean, the publisher's
robustly made.
Listen, what about writing then? Are you in a writing phase at the moment? Would you be?
No,
it would be tall.
It would be. And I think I love the time when I go back to my desk and it's quiet and I'm writing. And last year I had 15 months of unbroken writing, not only the next novel in my Burning Chambers series, The City of Tears, but also my first major play, which is an adaptation of my novel, The Taxidermist's Daughter, which is for Chichester, my hometown theatre, and one of the great theatres of the country. And so I was absolutely sequestered away all of last year writing. So I was really looking forward to being out and about and publicising. And I love going to bookshops, as you know. I love meeting readers. It was going to be a succession of travels, talks, all of that. What is strange is it's all gone. It's all been bumped till next year. So in terms of my publications. And so
City of Tears is now scheduled for next year, is that right?
It's now scheduled. It should have been coming out on May the 28th and May the 26th in America, and all of that. And now they're all coming out in January 2021, including the German and the French and the Italian. So there are good things about that. I'll have a global publication date, which I haven't had before, and that will be terrific. But it means that I'm facing another year of confinement within my study, because there is now no excuse for book 3 being late to the publishers. Macmillan are always very supportive when there's the dog ate my homework moment. But there really is no time. And I'm incredibly lucky because in January and February, even though it was a bit daft because we didn't have much time, I travelled to Stellenbosch and Franschhoek in South Africa, and then to the Canary Islands, which is where book 3 is set. And got back in just before all of this happened. So I have my physical research. And as you know, all of my books they come out of place. And I don't know what I'd be doing if I hadn't had those trips already. But as it is, I've got lots of photos, and I'm just getting on with book number 3 and play number 2. And it's just not the year I was looking forward to. It will be great, but I was really looking forward to being allowed out. Well, 2021, I'm going to be 60 in 2021. I'm going to make that year the best year ever. So whenever the play happens, I'm just thinking in terms of, okay, No, that's going to be the year for me.
Well, and if life has kind of plugged back into something like normality, then there's going to be an awful lot of touring opportunities if your book's coming out in every different territory.
Exactly. I could just be basically away for 6 months. I mean, I don't know. The thing that's really interesting is I was talking to other author friends the other day, and we were all talking about what we felt about going on planes, not just in terms of feeling safe on a plane in terms of infection or anything, but more in terms of the joy of our skies without all of that air travel. I think that every single person can hear the difference in the level of birdsong because it's not all drowned out, but everyone can smell the difference wherever you live, whether you live in London or whether you live in Sussex, whether you live in Bath, wherever you live, we all can tell the difference. And I think that will be interesting. So it's not that I don't think I'll ever get on a plane again. I absolutely will. But in terms of if I'm going to Carcassonne, if I'm going to Amsterdam, which is where I love and where much of the City of Tears is set, I think that I will be saying, well, go on the train. The places you can get to without using air. So it'd be we've got to find good things and learning things out of this terrible situation.
Exactly. Well, listen, one of the things it gives people a chance to do is read The Burning Chambers now, so that they're ready in January. So for those who haven't read that, can you just sort of tell me a little bit about about the setup and about and introduce us to the characters, one of whom is the daughter of a bookseller, which is obviously a great thing.
All the best stories begin in bookshops, Nick, as you
exactly. And so this, and with place, I mean, this was you going back to Carcassonne. So
Burning Chambers as a sequence, it will be 4 books, and it will cover 300 years of history. It's a sort of big epic adventure story, really, a saga, really, a Romeo and Juliet story of a 300-year feud between 2 families, one Catholic, one Protestant, Huguenot, and it starts on the eve of the outbreak of the French Wars of Religion in France, so at the very end of February 1562, and the novel will finish where the prologue of the novel starts, the 4th novel in Franschhoek in 1862, and it's a story of forbidden love. It's a story of what happens to us, the normal people, in the great sweep of history. And I was so struck by the fact when I was researching into the wars of religion, which covered a whole generation in France. And it was a civil war, really, between the Huguenots and the Catholics. And it destroyed France's prosperity and economic well-being for many hundreds of years. But I was interested in the fact that although, we know that wars of religion are very, very rarely about faith. They are always about power. And in France, it was particular in that it was about a weak Catholic king at court, a strong mother, Catherine de' Medici, kind of as guardian over, her son, another strong Catholic family, the Guise family, and very powerful Huguenots, Coligny and Condé. And I was really fascinated by the fact that the more I went into the archives, the more that I saw that although there'd been skirmishes between Catholics and Huguenots for some time, in truth, this was not something that influenced most people's day-to-day lives. So I wanted to start the novel as any of us would like to be. Do any of us define ourselves by one thing? Mostly not. We are all sorts of things. And Minou Joubert, who's my lead character, the daughter of the bookseller, the novel starts with her going to her father's bookshop in the Bastide of Carcassonne and opening up the shop and saying good morning to her Catholic neighbours and her Jewish neighbours and her neighbours who are not one thing or other. And I was just fascinated by that, about the fact that hundreds of miles away in north of France, the next day, the 1st of March, 1562, a massacre would take place that would destroy everybody's lives forever. And that sense of not knowing that you are at the beginning of an enormous shift in history. One of my favorite plays is Bernard Shaw's Heartbreak House. And that incredible sense of the autumn of England, that old England, in that summer, not knowing that actually that war was going to change the world forever,
Right.
that it was really the end, the absolute end of something. And so I had all of these things in my mind. But funnily enough, the story actually started right on the other side of the world in Franschhoek,
Right.
in the Cape winelands. And I was there at a literary festival and was being driven into town. And so we came down into the valleys. It's about 30k east of Cape Town, Franschhoek, and past Stellenbosch. I saw a sign at the side of the road that said Languedoc. And I was
Right.
like, what? This is
Yes.
very odd. Kept going down and suddenly started to see all the wineries, all the domaines had French names, not Cosa or Afrikaans or English even, but French. And then when I got to the main street, I saw the street was called Huguenot Street.
Right.
And so I was like, this moment I smelt a rat. And
Yes,
I
exactly.
said to the driver, I had no idea there was a French history here. And he looked at me and he said, well, don't you know that Franschhoek means in Afrikaans, the French corner? And I was like,
right. Oh.
So I ran in between my events to, I was at a book festival,
Right. Yeah.
to the end of the road and went to the Huguenot Museum and went inside and discovered the most, for me, mind-blowing piece of history, which was that the governor of the Dutch East India Company, who had stolen the land from the African people who owned it, obviously in the Cape, in the 17th century, sent word back to Amsterdam, having realized that the land in the Cape, in the Eastern Cape, was very similar to the land in Languedoc, southwest France.
Right.
And realized, if that was the case, that maybe they could plant vines and make their own wine.
Right.
Because then they wouldn't have to ship wine all the way from Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, all the way round past the Canary Islands, stopping at the Cape of Good Hope, and then on to their territories, more stolen territories that they had in the Far East, in what was called Batavia then. And so this letter went back and said, if there are any French Huguenot refugee winemakers in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam was the great refugee city, and of course the refugees made, in part, Amsterdam the great sea power it was in the 17th century. It was all that skill coming into this tiny country helped it. If there are anybody there, we will pay for your passage on a ship. We will pay for a pastor to go with you to administer to your spiritual needs. We will, when you land, give you a farm and money to buy instruments and equipment and vines to plant. And 7 families sailed.
Wow.
And it was just, and I then went to the back room of the museum and I ran my finger down all the names of the people on those first ships that landed in the Cape, and just off, when religious toleration finally ended in France in 1688. And there on that list, I found the name of a family that I'd written about in Labyrinth. And it was, it was like, oh my God. And so then you can imagine, Nick, I kind of looked up and I thought, don't do this. Don't do this, Mosse. You know nothing about the 17th and 18th century. You know nothing about sea travel. You know nothing about South Africa. And that is obviously a very delicate area to write about.
Yeah.
Just don't do this.
However, you went home.
I went out into I went into the graveyard because I like a graveyard, as you know. And because all of this is so fascinating, the idea that in part the South African wine industry was started by Huguenot refugees. I mean, it's just so wonderful, particularly coming from Languedoc, which is a great wine region.
Yeah.
But all of that is just fact. It's just stuff. As a novelist, there's got to be something that makes you think, this is my story, not research, but the story. And I stood in the graveyard and it was very moving, looking at all the names on the graves, the Jouberts, the Dutois, the de Villiers, the Jourdains, all of them stretched out, and quite an unkempt graveyard. The modern bit was looked after, but these were the old graves from the 19th century mostly. And then I looked up at the mountains that ring the town of Franschhoek, the Franschhoek Mountains, and I suddenly thought, just imagine if you were a young woman who had grown up for 300 years, as it were, hearing stories of loss, of how your family were forced to leave the place they loved, could never go home. And you'd heard the stories from your mother and her great-great-grandmother going back 300 years to 1562 in Carcassonne. But what about if you arrived here looking for the story of your ancestors, and you looked up at those mountains, and they looked like home. They
Right.
looked like the mountains that you'd heard about, because the Franschhoek Mountains look so similar to the mountains in Ariège,
Really?
which is where my family live, in Puy-Vert.
Yeah.
It's very similar land, and it's bright, endless blue skies, and very
Really?
hot and high winds. And at that moment, I thought, oh no, I've got it. Because all refugee stories are sad, almost by definition. They are stories of loss and of nostalgia and of injustice, but also the idea that you could find another place and make it home, and it would be, you know, what
Yeah.
you'd heard all of your life. So out of that, this moment in a graveyard,
Yeah.
came this whole sense. And of course, the novel is an adventure novel.
Yeah.
You know, I've tried to write it like a thriller. It moves along very fast.
Yeah.
It's not a reflective novel about what it means to be a refugee, but behind it, it is absolutely that sense of, you know, we can find another place and make it home.
And book 2 that we would have been about to sort of devour in May, that's primarily in Amsterdam, or we're
Primarily in
heading
Amsterdam.
out of France now?
Yes, I'm starting to follow the route. So it starts in Puy-Vert at the beginning, 10 years after The Burning Chambers finishes. The novel's called The City of Tears, and the City of Tears is indeed Amsterdam. And the family, our family, the Joubert family, are trying to decide whether to go to Paris for the royal wedding. And of course, anyone who knows their wars of religion will be shrieking, do not go. Because one thing everybody knows about the wars of religion was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 1572. But my family do go, and they will never go home again to Puy-Vert. You know, they will never see that place again. And of course, as the copycat massacres go out of Paris, everywhere is sacked. There are many massacres, about 12 major massacres after the St. Bartholomew's Day. And it is the moment at which things change. Before, it has been quite an equal battle, 3 wars before, between Catholics and Protestants. At this moment, the Protestant leadership is pretty much wiped out. And my family flee to Amsterdam, the great refugee city. And it's that story, and of the missing relic that people will remember from the burning chambers, and the enemy that has been sort of pursuing them and hunting them down all of this time, of course, finally finds them again. And it's an extraordinary thing. It's of course, like any war, any displacement, the way that people could disappear and be found again, but equally, you know, that period of time. So I didn't really know when I started The City of Tears. I love Amsterdam, and I spent a month there last year as a guest of the Dutch Literature on a fellowship at Dutch Literature Foundation, doing the research into that. So the bulk of the novel is my love letter to Amsterdam. But what I find is I do all of the research, all the background, and then I let them go, as it were. So I knew my family were going to go to Paris, but I didn't know who was going to survive. I didn't know what was going to happen. And in the end, whereas the first one, I suppose, Burning Chambers, is a story of forbidden love against the backdrop of war, The City of Tears is a story of a missing child. And I think for any parent, the thought of losing your child and never knowing what happened to them is probably the worst thing that any of us can imagine. And so the story took me in directions I wasn't expecting at all. And I had great fun writing it. And then there's even a section now also in Chartres, which readers of Labyrinth will recognize as a city that I love, because again, suddenly my people were heading off to Chartres, and I was very surprised. So there we go. But this is the joy of writing historical fiction. And the truth is that in lockdown or not, you can go anywhere in the world on the pages of a book. And that's of course, the joy of it.
Although you have to, I suppose now with this next, as you start writing volume 3 or book 3, you have to hope that your characters don't decide to go off somewhere where you're not very familiar with, because you haven't.
Exactly. They can't do that. Exactly. They can't do that. I mean, it will be a very odd experience for me because I take longer to write books. I'm not like some of the amazing crime writers. They produce a book every year, some of them, and many of the children's writers, and I'm in enormous awe of that. But my books take longer. So I will never before have been writing a big book, as it were, when I haven't yet publicized or
Right.
published the one before.
Right.
And I'm interested to know how that will influence things, because
Yeah.
I don't have any feedback.
No.
You know, well, I mean, I
Right,
do
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, one thing I want to know that I've asked a couple of people is, if this whole situation that we're in were to suddenly end, which it won't suddenly end, because if it did end, sort of, where would you be the first place you would rush off to? Be that abroad or a shop around the corner, or, you know?
I would go to Carcassonne without a doubt, because even though I haven't been able to spend long periods of time there for some time, I go every year about this time for a few days, and then nip backwards and forwards, maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 months. It depends, just even for a couple of days. Because the truth of it, even though in book 3 Carcassonne won't appear except possibly in dispatches from home, I live in Chichester, and it's a place, you know, I'm born and bred. My sisters live round the corner. We have an extended family here with my parents before they went, and my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law is around the corner. My nieces and nephews all live here. This is the land that I came from. And with a period of time at university and then in London for a bit, this is where I've always lived. So it is properly my home. However, because of that, all the time when in Chichester, I was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's pupil, somebody's friend, somebody's girlfriend, somebody's, all of these things. And it was going to Carcassonne 31 years ago now, and being anonymous. In Carcassonne, I was nobody. I just was another person stepping off the train with my husband, and at that stage, a baby about to happen, and soon another one. And because I went to Carcassonne, I became the writer that I am. And so that sense, even if I'm not writing about Carcassonne, the minute I get off the train, I love the slow travel of flying into Toulouse and then getting the slow train and arriving in the landscape, and that first glimpse out of the right-hand window of the Pyrenees. And at this time of year, there is still snow on the top, but the sky is so blue and so clear, and the fields are green, and it is April in Carcassonne is the perfect time. And this will be, I think, the first spring in 30 years I've not been there. And that feels like something. And of course it will happen again. It will be fine. I was there in January. It's not that it's gone away. But I will do just that thing, because I feel my writing shoulders just go down. And I've written a little bit of every book I've written in Carcassonne, even if it's not set there. So just that reconnection with the place that started it all off for me.
Oh, that's amazing. And listen, one last question. What about what do you feel about how this is going to impact on the world of books more generally? And I'm thinking particularly of your involvement with championing literature prizes and what have you.
I think that there are some industries you can see that there will be change, and they probably won't go back to exactly where they were before. I think in ours it's really hard. I think the really important thing at the moment is that many writers are struggling, because not only because their books are being delayed and therefore they won't necessarily be getting a payment or on publication or whatever, but because many writers have resting jobs, as it were, that are also furloughed or not happening at all. And none of us are furloughed. None of us have got it's not how it works for us. We're freelancers, so I think that is a really important thing. And I'm really glad that there are many things like the Society of Authors grant fund, and actually the DCMS trying to work out where writers fit in to genuinely set up hardship funds. I am very concerned about your sector, the independent booksellers, who are, for authors like me in particular, the lifeblood of our publishing. However, I think that the fact that many of you have been able to keep things going online rather than in the real world is a great strength. And I think that there will be smaller events start to be allowed to happen. So far as the prize is concerned, obviously I'm the founder director of the Women's Prize for Fiction, and we announced our shortlist this week, and we did it digitally and remotely and on social media. And I've had the biggest engagement with the shortlist that we've pretty much ever had.
Really?
Because people are much more, everybody has become skilled very quickly about how to use these things.
Yeah.
And using Zoom and making films and sharing them and all of that. And I do absolutely welcome that, because one of the things that I have always campaigned about and have been worried about is how, it's not surprising, obviously, as a carer of older people, I think older people get left out very, very easily because the lack of mobility is forgotten. I think people like me, like you, who don't live in London or Manchester or wherever, the idea that everybody can always get everywhere, can go to any literary festival they want, it is not true. No. If you're a carer, if you have disabilities, if you have a very limited budget, you can't get to things. Yeah. So I really hope that some of these online festivals and things that are happening will continue to happen with a thought to all the people who have always been left out of that before. Yeah. And what I would love to see is literary festivals, a big screen being set up in every local library. Yeah. So that if you don't have the technology yourself or you don't feel very confident, then people could go to their local library and take part in a literary festival, because there will always be an online screened, streamed component. And I think those things could be very powerful. We've rescheduled the Women's Prize for Fiction announcement on the 9th of September. Yeah. From the 3rd of June. And so actually the thing that is rather wonderful for the prize is that in our 25th year, this is not what we would have chosen, but oddly, it is giving people, huge number of people, the chance to engage with the whole canon of the Women's Prize for Fiction. And in the end, the prize was founded for readers. It was founded to put original, accessible, brilliant, excellent writing by women in the hands of male and female readers who would love it. Yeah. And actually that is happening because everybody is confined. And I think, the thing that I feel about our industry is whatever part of it we are, it genuinely is an ecology. Everybody plays their part in it. We know where the problems are. We know that that there are some incredible people making sure diversity is at the top of the agenda, not at the bottom of it. And things are changing for all sorts of reasons in the last couple of years, but it's taken far too long and they haven't changed quickly enough. For example, the issue of class as well, and geography, about different types of voices, all of these things. And the fact that I think the industry has been quite nimble in adapting, taking things online, trying to engage. I would love if our industry came out with a whole new load of writers who never before had seen themselves as a writer, but now, because they've been able to engage more, think, oh, that could be me. And that would be the most amazing thing if we get new writing voices out of this. And we really might.
No, well, that would be brilliant. And I love the idea of libraries being involved as well. That would be
because the libraries are the place where people with much less resource and much less support can still go and be, everybody enters the library as an equal.
All right, listen, super. Thank you for chatting.
It's been lovely to see you, Nick. Well, I hope you'll invite me in January or February if we're allowed out.
We definitely will.
Do a bit of a reading.
All right.
All right, lovely to see you.
Very good to see you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye, Kate.
Please note, no book people were harmed in the making of this film, though some were technologically challenged. All books are available from www.mrbeesemporium.com.